It's really appropriate that we invited this year Peter Wood to give the Low lecture, because like Gus Low, Peter Wood has been a force in African American history, especially but not exclusively the field of African American history in the colonial period. Peter grew up in St. Louis, so there's a connection to Gus Low there too, and he also grew up in Baltimore. So this lecture represents a homecoming of sorts. He received his scholarly education at Harvard and at Oxford, where he was a Rhodes Scholar in the 60s. And then he worked at the Humanities Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, before he came to UMBC, where he came with such fame that he skipped tenure and became an associate professor, having never been a professor before. Very enviable feat, I think. And he then taught at Duke for more than 30 years, from 1975 to 2008. He's had an enormous number of honors. He's been a Guggenheim Fellow. He's been a Senior Mellon Fellow. He's been an elected member of the Harvard Board of Overseers. He served on the editorial board of all the major journals in his field, like Ethnohistory, William and Mary Quarterly, Journal of Southern History. He's now retired, but he continues to write and to do research, and he likes to have people know that he grows gourds. He is about to move to Colorado with his wife, Elizabeth Fenn. Some of you read her book, Pax Americana, in History 701. They're going to move to Colorado next month, in a couple of weeks, but next month. Professor Wood's work, as he explained this morning to the students of History 201, has been motivated really by how much is missing in American history. And to help rectify that, particularly that stuff that has been missing around the issues of race and slavery, his work has sort of taken three different but related paths. The first one is the work that he has done in African American history. His first book, Black Majority, won the Beveridge Prize from the American Historical Association, and it really dug up the history of African Americans in colonial South Carolina. And Peter used to tell the story to us that when he began that work, of course, everybody at Harvard who was doing colonial history was studying colonial New England. They were just doing one after another study of towns in New England. And so when Peter told his advisor, who's a very famous historian still alive, that he was going to talk not only about that he wanted to do research not only about the South, but about African Americans, they were quite shocked. And apparently his advisor told him, okay, then if you must, you go down there and wrap that story up. And of course, in fact, what happened is that Peter wrote this book, which is still being assigned in courses, even though it's now almost 40 years old. And instead of wrapping it up, he opened up the field of colonial African American history, and he has done a tremendous amount to bring to the public and to the profession a greater understanding of what he has come to call the terrible transformation, the transformation to hereditary and racial slavery that has had such an enormously profound impact on American culture and American history. He's written other books about slavery. One of them was called Strange Land. But he then shifted some of his focus to Native American history. And I think that came partly out of an interest in demographics. And in Native American history, again, he has really made a mark. He has co-edited a very influential book called Powhatan's Mantle, which deals with Indians in the colonial Southeast. And then he's had this third interest, really a lifelong interest in Winslow Homer. In 1988, he worked with an art scholar, Karen Dalton, on a pathbreaking exhibit and a book called Winslow Homer's Images of Blacks, the Civil War and Reconstruction Years. In 2004, he published Weathering the Storm, inside Winslow Homer's Gulf Stream, the last painting that Winslow Homer did and about which he talked to the 201 students this morning. And then Dr. Wood's newest book is based on his 2009 Huggins lectures at Harvard, and it is called Near Andersonville, Winslow Homer Civil War, and today's lecture is drawn from that book. Moreover, Professor Wood is the author of an important history text called Created Equal, which is now in its third edition, and he's working on a fourth. And I'm enormously pleased that Dr. Wood is today's Lois lecturer, not only because he's an eminent scholar of early America and of slavery, but also because he was my graduate advisor, as well as the advisor of Dr. Boughton. I wasn't going to forget you. At Duke when we were there. And I don't think that anyone could have ever been a better advisor than Professor Wood was. Most of the students who ended up working with him didn't come to Duke to do colonial history. Dr. Boughton, I think, came to do 20th century labor history. I had no idea what I was going to do. But we all fell under Professor Wood's spell. Once we took a seminar with him, we were completely hooked. And I'm not exactly sure how he did it. Hook us, I mean. But he did hook us. And we would come to his office. He had this humongous cathedral-like office. It must have been 15 by 15 feet, with wall-to-wall books. Super intimidating, but also very cozy. We sat around this huge antique table that he had that must have been able to seat 15 people if it hadn't been laden with books. And then he would sit there and we would talk and talk. We would be full of ideas and full of opinions. Particularly, we would be full of opinions. And he would let us talk, and then in that soft voice of his that you're going to hear in a moment, softer today because I think he has a little bit of a cold coming on. With that soft voice, he would make some seemingly innocuous remark, just some mild sentence or question. And we would sit there for a second. And then we would realize that the world was never be the same, that the world would never be the same again. That with that one little question, that one little remark, everything looked different. And so I think it's that very quality that he had that made us come back and back and back. First of all, we wanted that feeling. It was like going down an elevator, you know, when your stomach makes a flip. We wanted to have those stomach flips when he did that to us. But I think we also believed that if we studied enough and talked to him enough, and most importantly, if we thought enough, then maybe one day we would have a nugget of insight like that ourselves. He also managed better than anybody I have met before or since. He succeeded in making us realize that no matter what we talked about, it could be an event in anywhere in the world, that it was somehow connected to colonial America. And it made it seem as if colonial America contained a key that would unlock all mysteries. So he forced us as graduate students to turn assumptions on their heads. And it was both disorienting, but also exhilarating. And it is for such teaching that Professor Wood actually was recently awarded the Asher Distinguished Teaching Award from the American Historical Association. And so I'm enormously pleased that Professor Wood has agreed today to work his magic, not just on me, but on all of you.
I asked Marie-Elaine especially to just really hype this thing up. I mean, you know, just really get you pumped, you know, because I'm running for president of the United States, and so we really need. No, this is a treat, and thank you both. To be introduced by two former Duke scholars is a pleasure. As Marie-Elaine said, I'm a Dukey for another 3 weeks, and I'm sure you noticed the way I did that she interchanged the names of two universities there in a very nice way that I agree with, because the first thing I want to say is, as a Baltimorean who was in high school around here in the 50s when this school didn't exist, so this is my first visit to this campus, and I am really impressed. I mean, what a place. You're lucky to be here, you know, from the top down. You know, neat students, neat administration, terrific teachers. You're lucky. It's great. I also want to say that it's really neat for me. Never had this chance before to. I haven't, as Marie-Elaine said, I'm a colonial historian. So talking about the Civil War, I'm parachuting in from right field, and I'll do the best I can. But to be able to do it in the context of this exhibition, which some of you have already explored, and I hope the rest of you will, I think that Tom Beck and Ann Rubin have just really done an amazing job, and it's all a UMBC collection. It's been built up here over the last 30 years, pictures that most Civil War historians have never seen before, and some that are amazingly relevant to what I want to talk about. So as I talk about this picture, I'm going to be looking at, and you can look at later, these amazing shots of black soldiers at Ship Island in Mississippi in the middle of the war. I mean, it's just, we're just getting going in terms of understanding all this, and that's part of my argument today about this painting, which I'm going to dwell on. But I want to start out by just reminding you about Winslow Homer a little bit. Most of you are familiar, if not with his name, with his pictures. He's born in 1836 in Boston, dies in 1910, and he's one of America's most beloved and best known artists. He's very appealing, he's easy to connect with, his images often of adolescence, often of schools, of play, of sailing, of hunting and fishing. They're very well known and are often used to illustrate book covers. But he's particularly known as America's greatest artist of the sea. He painted sailors in all their activities. He painted the sea in all its moods. He spent the latter part of his life living at Prout's Neck on the coast of Maine, looking out over the Atlantic Ocean, where he painted this picture late in life. And he's known for that and has been known ever since his death. His centennial of his death was in 2010. The post office put out yet another Winslow Homer stamp, which they've done 2 or 3 before. I mean, he's that kind of an artist. And of course, he got his start as a Civil War artist. He went to work for Harper's Weekly in the late 1850s, was one of their leading illustrators as a young man, and living in New York. His day job was making these lithographs for Harper's, but at night he was taking painting classes and learning how to paint. His mother had been a very good watercolor painter. He had obvious skill. He'd been apprenticed to a lithographer, so he was honing his skills. And this picture on the left, called The Sharpshooter, which has become an icon of the Civil War, is the first oil painting he ever made. We have a colleague writes in his diary about, I went to Winslow Homer's studio today. He's working on this Sharpshooter, and we talked about how much he could get for, he was a Yankee, he was kind of looking, he was broke, he was looking for money, like, what do you think this, $60, they agreed that maybe if he's lucky he could sell it for $60, The last Winslow Homer painting that was up for public auction was bought by Bill Gates for $32 million. So this would be $60 was good. This other painting, which also becomes an icon of the Civil War, and which I'll come back to later, is finished in '66, goes on sale, and immediately launches his career. He's already kind of well known, but his career takes off. He's a good friend of this a Union officer who's from New York and who's actually running for political office in '66, and so this picture becomes very important, and I'll come back to it. But he also painted African Americans, and I talked with the 201 class about this some this morning, that what was interesting to me as someone who'd grown up being interested in Winslow Homer was the fact that the Homer scholars, of which there are many, had very little to say about his black images. They were aware of them. This one is in the Los Angeles Museum there, but they hadn't paid much attention to them. And that, given my interest in black history, this was a chance to focus on some of these pictures. As Maria-Elaine said, I did an exhibition back in the 80s with some of these pictures trying to put some deeper meaning into them, or to understand where Homer was coming from. This is one of my favorites, which is down in the Athens Museum in Georgia. It's not much bigger than a postcard. It's a very delicate little watercolor that's almost luminescent. And I want to just take a second to talk about it, to get you familiar with the way this guy works. This is at one level, this is a nice, almost sweet picture of a black adolescent, kind of diffident look on his face. But it's painted in 1875. And it's all about taking a sunflower to the teacher. It's about school. It's about education. It could be, some of you remember when the United Negro College Fund used to have a slogan that said, "A mind is a terrible thing to waste." You know, this is almost a poster for black education. And black education was one of the key issues on the table nationally during Reconstruction. That is to say, these children who were born in slavery but are not slaves now, will they have access to it? What does it mean that they're free? Will they then get an education and become participating members of the society, and how's that going to work? These were tremendous debates, and as you know, they didn't turn out very well. But there was a lot of optimism in the 1860s and 70s that they would. This child represents that. But look how Homer plays with it. He's got a butterfly on his shoulder, right? I mean, starts out as a caterpillar, turns into a butterfly, takes wing. You know, is this kid, going to take wing or not? Is he going to be given a chance to fly? The sunflower, which sort of mirrors his face. The thing about a sunflower is that, whether it's mythical or not, it's supposed to sort of follow the sun. Right? It soaks up sunlight. It's what good students do, with good teachers, just soak up the light. So it's an emblem of being ready to learn. And in case you don't get it, he puts a blank slate down here in the corner, a blackboard with his initials on it, and just like, okay, this kid is, teach me how to read and write. I'm ready. Are you ready to let me do it? And he's able to say all that with just a few little watercolor strokes. This picture, which I talked about this morning in 201, is Homer's greatest and last image of an African-American figure. He paints it late in his life. It's one of the most famous paintings in American art. It's been hanging in the Metropolitan for 100 years. And I was struck studying this painting, that even with this painting, there'd been a lot of talk about his brush strokes and his, all kinds of ways of sort of avoiding the fact that there was a racial dimension to this picture that really needed to be taken apart. I've written a book about that. We're not going to take it apart, but it's an exciting painting, and it's very well known, even if it's not very well understood. The painting that I want to talk about is not the last and most famous, but the earliest and least famous. It's this painting. It's now called Near Andersonville. But I want to begin by just telling you the story of the picture itself, because it's pretty intriguing. This guy, Horace K. Corbin, was a very wealthy banker in northern New Jersey. And he died in 1960. And when he died, his 5 grown children and their spouses came together in this big mansion to sort of divide up the heirlooms and take what they needed and pass on the rest. So they contacted a junk dealer in northern New Jersey, asked from the Lincoln Storage Company, would he come in and take away the rest of the stuff? And he came and gave him he said, sure, I'll do it. I'll take it all away for $50. And then he called back the next day and said, I'm ready. Can I come with my truck? I'd like to pick that stuff up. And then he called back the next day and said, when can I get this stuff? And they smelled a rat. I thought this guy, there's something going on here. So they reconvened the next night, and to go over everything. And it's great because I know this story because it comes from an undergraduate paper. Those of you writing undergraduate papers can take heart in this. This guy's grandson was a sophomore at Trinity taking an art course, and he wrote a paper called How We Discovered a Winslow Homer Painting in Grandpa's Attic, which I got a copy of, and which had this very detailed, and so what he says in this paper, he says, they came together, and then my dad went up in the attic, and he poked around for half an hour, and then he hollered down, he said, anybody ever heard of a guy named Homer? And my mom hollered back, do you mean Winslow Homer? You know, and this is the picture that they brought down out of the attic. And so my first job was so that was in 1960. And these dates are significant in a certain way. They actually tried to sell the picture. And they start at the top. They offer it to Paul Mellon, who's one of the richest men in America and one of the great collectors of American art, for $40,000. And he turns it down, not interested. 2 years later, he buys another Winslow Homer, which I saw yesterday over in the National Gallery, of a nice white lady in a fancy dress, and they liked that one. They bought that, and it's now in the National Gallery. This one, they couldn't sell it for 6 years. It appeared, the very first exhibition of black images in American art was put together by the Bowdoin College, right near where Homer's papers are, I mean, in Maine, you know. Dr. King, Martin Luther King Jr., visited the exhibit, saw this picture, commented on it, saw other interesting pictures. They still couldn't sell it. So in 1966, they gave it to the Newark Museum. And they gave it to, in December of '66, Newark Museum gets this picture. 6 months later, the Newark race riots break out. 22 people are killed within 6 blocks of the museum. It's not a time when this beleaguered urban museum wants to do research on a 19th century painting. You know? So they never really bothered. They're proud to have it. They kind of tuck it away. They're not sure what to make of it. Nobody knows what the title of it is. At first, they show it to an art scholar, or the first guy who sees it says, we should call it Captured Liberators, because as you saw, and we'll go back to it, there's some soldiers in the background, so it has to do, you know, and we're looking at it from her perspective, so maybe that. Then they showed it, and this illustrates my point, they showed it to the leading Homer scholar, the Big Daddy, and he said, no, Homer's not interested in that sort of stuff. We'll call it At the Cabin Door. Right, just complete, you know, Aunt Jemima, you know, I mean, we will totally diffuse any significant implications and just say that here's a painting of the cook, you know. And that's the way it stood, and I'll solve that puzzle in a minute. But first, I had to find out how it had gotten into the Corbin family and the Kellogg family. His name was Horace Kellogg Corbin. I went back through these genealogy books of his family and found that in the antebellum period, there was this Kellogg ancestor who had 14 children by 2 wives. And I was in the genealogy book looking at it, and they were all just listed, born here, died here, born here, until I got down to Sarah Louise Kellogg. And this is what, there was this little asterisk, and this is what it said about her. During the last 2 years of her life, Miss Kellogg was engaged at Port Royal, South Carolina, in active efforts for the education of the freedmen, and in that cause contracted the disease which terminated her valuable and heroic life. Well, some of you who've done some Civil War history know about Port Royal. I knew about it because of my South Carolina interests. My early work had been in South Carolina, and one of the inspirations for me had been a woman who's still here in Baltimore, living in a rest home now and long retired, but a woman named Willie Lee Rose wrote a book called Rehearsals for Reconstruction about the Port Royal experiment. I don't know if any of you know this story, and I'll be brief about it, but when the war begins, the Union figures they want to get a foothold deep on the Confederate coast. They have a naval advantage, And if they can grab hold of some port in South Carolina, it ends up being Port Royal near the mouth of the Savannah River. If they can do that, then whatever happens later, and this is Dr. Rubin's Sherman's march, eventually when Sherman marches to the sea, he's trying to get to Port Royal. He's trying to reestablish, he's in enemy territory, he's trying to reestablish contact with Union supply lines. And so on November 7th, 1861, early in the war, the Union Navy bombards Port Royal Harbor, Beaufort, South Carolina. This is the Sea Islands. These are wealthy cotton growers who are exploiting slave labor. They all leave for Charleston to escape and leave 10,000 African Americans living on the Sea Islands right there. Been enslaved their whole lives, never been off the islands. And they become very quickly a cause for interest in the North. Northern do-gooders of various kinds start sending clothes, start sending Bibles, start sending, this is going to be a mobilized, and a few very committed young people, black and white, men and women, volunteer to go there and start teaching school. They call themselves Gideon's Band because they have almost a religious, biblical commitment to. It's like some of you who might decide to go teach school in Afghanistan even as the war is going on, right? And your parents tell you that's a crazy idea, even though that's noble of you to think about it, but don't think about it. They were saying, "Sorry, Mom, I'm going," and they did. They were amazing. Sarah Louise Kellogg was one of those people, and she was actually one of the best teachers in the group. She contracts tuberculosis and dies in June of 1866, and I actually found her gravestone in the big graveyard outside Newark. It's about 10 minutes from the Newark airport. And she's you can almost see from this family plot that she's the odd one out in the family, right? I mean, she was the one, and at first they were proud of her, and you could tell from that obituary, which was written 10 years later. Then I found this. Oh, well, let me, I'm jumping ahead. This is a picture from the Sea Islands, okay, that shows the kinds of people that she would have been teaching when she arrived there. Black adult women, many of them, working the cotton fields. You see this boat back here? After the Union Navy had taken Port Royal, they had to leave a ship to control the place. Right? It's called the Kingfisher. One of the people on board the Kingfisher was Winslow Homer's younger brother, Arthur, who had enlisted in the Navy. So to me, that means that the Homer family back in New England had a particular interest in what was going on at Port Royal. They would have known about it. We know from the diaries of some of these teachers that on weekends they would row out to the ship and fraternize with these New England sailors, and they were aware. So it may even be that Miss Kellogg had met Arthur Homer, so that then when she gets back to New York and is dying of tuberculosis, maybe this picture is given to her. Maybe she's wealthy, she could have bought it. But here's one of the few people in the North who had the money, but also the knowledge and the awareness and commitment to be interested in that picture. To say, wow, on my deathbed, I want that picture in that's what I stand for. That's about all I know about it, and we may learn more eventually someday. But what I did find was that in 1960, when the museum got the picture, they talked, 66 I guess, they talked to one of the old relatives. He remembered as a 4-year-old boy in 1884, a photographer coming to his grandma's house, and he remembered that picture used to hang by the sideboard right there. He put a big arrow just to prove it, right? So in 1884, it's hanging in the house with some pride, though it's being sort of confused with a picture of a German maid over here. So she's now been kind of reduced to a servant, maybe, and she's not. And then she goes up in the attic, right? And the reason I dwell on this story is because, to me, this is an amazing metaphor. This is us. This is America. This is what happened. You know, that in the 1860s, in the 1870s, these issues were on the front burner. People knew about them. By the 1880s and 90s, they're on the back burner. Then they're in the attic. Then we simply stop thinking about them and talking about them. And ironically, it's in 1960, just when this picture comes down out of the attic, that we're beginning, you know, not quick enough for this picture, but we're beginning to start to ask questions, rethink things. Now, I talked a little bit about the title. So it sits in the museum for 20 years, and then in the 80s, there's an exhibition being planned, and a very good art historian comes across this clipping in a New York paper from 1866. So it's Patriots' Day, 1866. This picture is going to be on sale tonight. There's a bunch of pictures being sold by a bunch of different artists. There's this guy named Winslow Homer. The New York Times actually misspelled his name because he wasn't well known at the time. But this reviewer said that there's a picture entitled Near Andersonville depicting a Negro woman standing at the door of her cabin gazing at Union prisoners as they pass. It's full of significance, right? So bingo, I talked to this guy and he tells a wonderful story about how he was actually driving in his car flipping through these pages when he hit this thing. He said he almost had a wreck. He was so excited, you know, because he had struck art history gold. You know, he had figured out what the title of, which obviously gives different meaning to this picture. So that is if we know about Andersonville. And it used to be that all Americans knew about Andersonville, and now it's, you know, it's a scattered knowledge. So let me say a little more about Andersonville. One of the things that happens in the course of the war, and it's illustrated in these pictures, is that early in the war, as you know, there's no acknowledged black participation. There are blacks building battlements because they're being forced to for the Confederacy, and there are blacks trying to volunteer for the Union Army and being turned away. And it's only after the Peninsula Campaign, after the Emancipation Proclamation, that by early in '63, black soldiers are beginning to be utilized in the war. The consequence of that, one consequence, is that early in the war, prisoner exchanges had been going on rapidly and readily. Once the Union says they're going to employ black soldiers, most of whom are former slaves, the Confederacy reacts by saying, we're not going to treat them as prisoners of war, we're going to treat them as escaped slaves and put them back into slavery. The Union then responds by saying, well, if you're going to do that, we're not going to have any prisoner exchanges, right? Which means that the prisons, north and south, begin to fill up immensely. And in Richmond, the prisons are overflowing. They're afraid there's going to be a prison break or that the Union is going to get to them. They decide to build a new prison as far away from the front as they can. They pick a godforsaken area in southwest Georgia, near a little town called Andersonville. If you've ever been to Plains, Georgia, to see where Jimmy Carter grew up, which is an amazing spot, it's about 10 miles from there. And it's an amazing site to visit at present. But it's built, ironically, by forced African-American enslaved labor. They're forced to build a camp, a stockade, really, for these Union soldiers who are in fact fighting to try to liberate them. So there's obvious ironies there. And by the summer of 1864, this is what it looks like. This is an amazing picture that's drawn 20 years later by a survivor who can't get it out of his mind. A lot of people don't survive. There's something like 42,000 soldiers go into Andersonville, and 13,000 of them die and are buried right there. You can still see the huge cemetery. The ones that do survive and get out, some of you may know this story since we're you know what the Titanic is, right? But if I asked you what's the biggest maritime disaster in American history, it's not the Titanic. It's the Sultana. And the Sultana in the late spring, you know, after the war has ended, after Lincoln has been shot, after all these terrible, strange things have happened. 2 weeks later, there's 2,000 of these guys have been taken to Memphis and put on board the Sultana to be taken north up the river to go home. They've survived. 2 days into the trip, in the middle of the night, the Sultana, the boilers burst on the Sultana, and all these guys, most of whom weigh about 100 pounds and are emaciated, are thrown into the Mississippi River and drowned, or scalded to death, or 1,600 people, most of them survivors of Andersonville. This is O'Day's image of that, and he actually drew around the side of it, he drew little vignettes, scenes of this guy. This is 20 years later. This guy remembers every detail. You know, and the rest of the country, and you can imagine this has moved on. You know, so they don't want to hear about this stuff anymore. This is what it was like to be on the detail of burying the bodies of your comrades who had just died. In August of '64, prisoners are dying at the rate of 100 a day, which is like one person every 15 minutes. And they're being put in wagons and hauled out, buried in shallow graves. This is what some of the survivors looked like when they came home. So these are shocking pictures, and they were meant to shock. They were used sometimes almost, I mean, there was a sense of pride of some of these survivors. It would be like an Auschwitz survivor being able to show you their number on their sleeve or something. These people wanted others to know what they had been through. And it's part of the reason why we've sort of lost sight of Andersonville in interesting ways. But at the time, that Homer is painting this picture, he starts in '65, finishes in '66. So in the fall of '65, okay, now the Sultana has been 2 months before, the war's been over for 3 or 4 months. In the summer, late summer and fall of '65, they seized the captain, the officer who was in charge at Andersonville, and put him on trial in Washington, D.C. And this is the best picture I could find, because there's a better one right over on that wall. I wish I'd had it. So you can go look at it afterwards. This is the hanging of Henry Wirz, who was the only Confederate officer hung for treason. You know, he was made sort of a scapegoat for the whole complicated affair, and a lot of Confederates sprung to his defense and said, "No, you're martyring this guy." But there were a lot of former prisoners and Union soldiers who were saying, "No, you know, he deserves worse than that." You know, so anyway, everybody was talking about Andersonville in the fall of '65, spring of '66. So it's as though 150 years from now you found some picture that had Abu Ghraib written on it, and you thought, "Whoa, what's that all about? You know, what were they talking about? You know, why were they so upset about this?" Anyway, so near Andersonville was very loaded at the time, right? You got that much. Now let me talk a little bit about Homer's Civil War career before I get to the picture itself. Homer, as I say, he's been apprenticed to a lithographer. He's really good. By the time he's working at Harper's, he's their best guy. It's as though you were the best photographer for Time magazine, and they said, "Okay, the new president, you know, you got to go take his photograph because it's going to be on the cover next week." So when Lincoln gets elected, they hand him a Matthew Brady photograph and say, "Turn this into a lithograph. We're putting it on the front page," you know, and they do it. So Homer, though we think of him in his later life as this reclusive bachelor living off on the coast of Maine, as a young man in his 20s and 30s, he is right in the thick of things. He's very aware of what's going on around him. He's actually, we would say that he was embedded with the Union Army. He's sent with Mr. Harper himself, gives him a letter of introduction to McClellan and says, "You go introduce yourself and plug in." And this is one of the first images he does dealing with the contraband phenomenon of Virginia slaves escaping to Union lines. It's early in the war still, but they're appearing. And what he captures here is the way in which these Yankee farm boys from all over the North have almost no experience with African Americans, and certainly not with enslaved Southern black people. You can see that Homer actually doesn't even, he gets the hair right, but he has him dancing an Irish jig. I mean, he doesn't even quite, he doesn't get the moves, you know. Old black guy in the corner playing a fiddle, you know. And what we know from letters, that some of them were mesmerized, some of them were interested, some of them were supportive, some of them were a little blasé or disrespectful or uninterested, were totally concerned about saving the Union, not about freeing the slaves. I mean, those were the issues early in the war. But look at this. This is classic Homer. Too small to see. You've got a couple of card players down here in front, little piece of paper between them, and it just says 3 letters, I-O-U. Right? So it's, you know, it might be I owe you $1.50 for, you know, because you drew the ace of hearts, you know. But it's also this much big, there's some big reckoning to be done here. You know, this is now all the chips are coming home, you know, and how's it going to work out? They have no idea in 1861. He goes to the front. He sees some of the carnage of the Peninsula campaign. We don't have many letters, but we do have a letter that his mother wrote after he had been in the campaign. Let me just want, and she says this. She says, this is June 7th, just before this picture comes out. She says, Winslow, she's writing to Arthur, the other brother on board the Kingfisher. She said, reporting on Winslow. He has been to the front at Yorktown. That's part of the Peninsula campaign. There's a picture of the Yorktown fortifications, first one on your right as you walk in. He's been seeing all this. He's been there firsthand. Winslow went to the front at Yorktown and camped out about 2 months. He returned from the front so changed that his best friends did not know him. And I would argue, and then the next sentence says, don't worry, he's okay now, he's feeling better. But it's a classic, you know, she's reassuring her other son who's putting his life on the line. But this is a sensitive guy who's seeing combat for the first time, and like thousands of others at the same time, it has a lasting effect on him. I mean, we might now call it post-traumatic stress, but it shapes his whole life. And the best quick illustration that I can give you of that is that in 1865, he creates this picture for Harper's called The Empty Sleeve at Newport. A soldier still wearing his Union cap. He's had his left arm blown off in the war. He's got the empty sleeve folded across his heart, which makes you think that maybe maybe his heart has been wounded as much as his arm, you know, I mean, but most of all, you see that what a strange relationship this is with his spouse or his girlfriend, or he's come back to civilian life. Like all the returning veterans we read about and see on the news and hear their tough stories about that return. And she's squeezing the reins, she's got the whip in her, she's gonna make this thing work, but she doesn't know how. She's staring straight ahead, he's looking straight ahead, they've both got deep shadows over their eyes. He gets it, you know, and he's expressing what, you know, he has seen what thousands of people are going through in that generation. But he's also creating images of African Americans as he creates other images for the war. And I want to just play with this one for a second, which is one of the things you can do as an artist, which you can't do as a photographer embedded with the 53rd Infantry, you know, but if you're just with a sketch pad, you can put yourself behind enemy lines. You can put yourself wherever you want. So he's now putting himself and his viewers, his readers, in a Confederate trench where black slaves are being forced, this Confederate officer with his sword drawn, is forcing these men, and there's just been a whole book written about this that's really quite amazing, about the Peninsula Campaign, about the numbers of African Americans who were forced to reinforce Confederate emplacements while being bombarded by Union troops, right? So in the distance, you've got Union cannons being fired from across the river, shells being lobbed in. But instead of focusing on the Confederate officer, here's the central figure, right? And he's not a foolish person. He's like Othello, right? I mean, he gets it completely. It's like, OMG, I mean, and if you don't get it, he's got 3 bayonets sticking out behind him, just, so you see that, like, whoa, this guy, he sees that he's about to be killed by the people who are supposed to be saving him, right? I mean, it's, so Homer captures that. But go a step further. Does date mean anything to you? This is 2 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln has just lobbed a huge shell behind enemy lines, right? And not very effectively, right? I mean, it's not clear what it's going to do or who it's going to free or whether it's going to make life worse for some of these guys instead of better or so, and Homer is not even giving his own answer. He's saying, this is what we're all wrestling with at the moment. But I dwell on that just because this is what he learned at Harper's, was how to embed things in these pictures to make you think about it at a lot of different levels. And he was doing the same thing with the oil paintings that he's creating. So one of the most famous is made in 1864. Again, this is current events. So for us, we look at, a lot of the art historians looked at it, that, Petersburg, okay, they're not even sure, what's that all about? I mean, it's obvious at one level what's going on is you're behind Confederate lines, you've got a Confederate soldier standing up, daring these Union sharpshooters to take a shot at him because they've been stuck in these trenches for 2 months, and they're doing it. So in fact, this guy may be dead before you know it. I mean, it's Confederate bravado, and he's just letting you think about that. So that's what's going on above the surface. But what's going on below the surface is even more interesting. If you ever saw the movie version of Cold Mountain, it begins with an incident called the Crater. It's not in the novel, but they put it in the movie because it's got a huge explosion, so they could have a big explosion. It's right outside Petersburg. There's a Union force from Pennsylvania. They're all coal miners. And they go to Grant and say, look, we're stuck here, but we could dig a tunnel all the way under Confederate lines, fill it up with gunpowder, blow it up, make a big crater, and we'll send the troops in. And the Union commanders say, great, we'll do it. And not only that, it's obviously going to be really dangerous, so we'll use black troops, because we now have black troops. So let's see how they do. Well, their officer is drunk, their white commander is drunk out of his mind. The thing goes off, these guys rush in, hundreds of them get killed, and the crater becomes sort of an emblem of how bogged down the war had become by the summer of 1864, okay? Now, what's neat about this to me is that when you look at this picture closely, and I realize it's hard to see, but there's a stick here, there's a gun here, there's bayonets over here, there's a black guy playing a banjo here, and if you follow this, all those things point right down here, right? If you saw this painting in the 1860s, you would know, oh my God, there's 500 pounds of dynamite under this thing that's about to blow up. So he's playing with you, and Homer very often didn't focus on the event itself. He let you do that in your imagination. It's like Shakespeare saying, off stage left, there's a huge war going on, or something. Piece out my imperfections with your thoughts. Okay, so with all that, now let's go back to the painting, end of the war, and try to make more sense out of it. We know it's near Andersonville. I want to talk a little bit more about the Andersonville connection. I want to talk about this stuff down here, and then a little bit about her, and we could go in other directions too, but that'll more than keep us busy. At the same time that Grant is bogged down outside Petersburg in the summer of '64, Sherman is bogged down outside Atlanta. You know, we tend, at least I did in high school and college, to sort of think the Civil War starts with Fort Sumter, and then you get to Gettysburg, and then that, you know, by the third day the Union wins, and then it's a done deal, right? And eventually we're gonna get to Appomattox, right? 64, and I'm just learning this. Ann could have said this to me years ago. You know, in '64, it's not at all clear who's going to win anything. It is really up for grabs. You know, the North is losing interest in the war. Thousands are dying. Sherman and Grant are the best generals Lincoln's been able to find, and they're bogged down. They both think they're going to lose their jobs if they can't do something pretty soon. And what Sherman does, at the same time that this desperate move of the crater is becoming a fiasco in Virginia, Sherman facing Atlanta, the only successes he's having are with his cavalry. They can go in, by that time the Union cavalry's gotten good, they can make these raids behind enemy lines. He figures that if they could go, let me jump to this picture and come back to that. If they could go around Atlanta, he'd send 4,000 cavalry around one side, 4,000 around the other. They would meet at Lovejoy Station and tear up the railroad that's bringing supplies up from Macon, okay? Now what happens is that the night before they leave, one of the officers, a guy named Stoneman, comes to Sherman and says, look, I'll do that, but I want to keep going. I want to go south to Macon and liberate, I'll jump back to the map here. I want to go south, liberate some officers who are imprisoned at Macon, and if that works, I want to go further south and liberate Andersonville, because we've all been hearing about the terrible things that are happening in Andersonville. And Sherman realizes, you know, it's a Hail Mary pass. I mean, like, wow, this is a long shot, but and he writes a memo. I gave a talk about this at the National Archives a few months ago, and the director afterwards, he said, come here, I got something I want to show you. And he had pulled out of the archives Sherman's note to this guy, which says, okay, you know, it's deniability. It's like, you know, if you screw up, I never told you to do it, you know, but if you can do it, he says, if you pull this off, you and your troops, and by implication me too as General Sherman, we will go down in history. You know, I mean, this is going to be awesome. You know, so I'll give you permission to do it, right? It's completely bungled. You know, these guys, they get this, these guys get to the railroad, tear it up. On the way back, they're surrounded by Confederate cavalry and cut to pieces. I mean, I've read diaries of some of the nurses who were on the field afterwards, and they said, you know, the blood was up in their petticoats, up to their knees. The ones who survive are shipped to Andersonville prison. At the same time, Stoneman, going around the east side, has gotten to Macon, but he's too slow. By the time he gets there, they've got word that he's coming. He's messed up the railroad lines here, but he tries to go back the same way he came, which is a mistake as a cavalry officer. He gets surrounded and cut to pieces. He's the highest ranking officer to be captured on either side. He's put in prison, and a lot of his men are marched off. And word of this gradually trickles back to the north. You know, so both the crater and Stoneman's raid. The crater is quite famous still in Civil War history. Stoneman's raid, nobody knows anything about it, but it's an equally huge fiasco, and it's very well known at the time, and Homer was very tuned into it. Now, he'd never been to Georgia, but he'd seen cavalry operations. You know, he knew these are just a couple of my favorite pictures of some of his images of people in battle, cavalry units heading out, guys dying on the battlefield, being given a canteen of water to try to get them through. I mean, Homer had seen this stuff firsthand, so he can imagine what's going on in Georgia. But look what he does. He puts this dramatic story, these soldiers in the back left-hand corner. You can see that these are blue-clad Union cavalrymen in their cavalry boots without rifles. These are Confederate soldiers with rifles and proudly hoisting the Confederate flag who've captured these guys, and they're marching them off to Andersonville. These are the captured liberators. These are the people that she thought were going to free her, and in fact, they're going to be imprisoned. But he puts that in the background, right? Makes it very small and makes you look at it not from their perspective, not from Stoneman's perspective, but from the perspective of the black woman. So that's 64. That's what he's dealing with here, but he's going further than that. And I want to go down here for a minute, because this is very strange. These are not what you would expect in these planks. Yes, she's sort of standing at a fork in the road, and but it looks a little contrived. What's it all about? Right? I think, well, first of all, look at this thing here. She looks like she's standing on a little stage or something. Do you know what that is? It's called a mudsill. Right? And every house had one in the 19th century. Is where you wipe the mud off your boots before you go inside. But just the way Andersonville became a buzzword, in the 1850s, mudsill became a buzzword. Right? In 1858, a racist senator from South Carolina gives a famous speech in the Senate about his mudsill theory of history. He's saying slavery is a positive good. He's saying, look, you Yankees don't understand this. Here's the way history works. It always has worked this way. Society, you've got to build it on a stable base. Just the way you have a mudsill in your house, we have a mudsill in the Union. And the mudsill is called Negro slavery. And that's where they are. That's their proper place in life. That's where they should stay. And we'll build a neat society on top of that. Whites in the North push back very quickly, including this guy from Illinois named Lincoln. Gives a speech saying, no, we object to the mudsill theory of history. That's not the way America is supposed to work. So to put her standing on a mudsill is loaded in just the way that Homer liked to load his pictures. But he loads it further. These are planks, right? Now, what's important about planks? Right? It turns out that in 1860, when Lincoln, this farm boy from Illinois, is running for president, the big image for the cartoonist was rail fences, right? This is the rail splitter. And all the cartoonists had images of rail fences everywhere, right? In 1864, the image they play with is planks, as in platforms. Some of you are old enough to remember when political parties really had a serious platform that they argued about, and they would write it out, and it made a difference who you voted for, as to which planks were in the platform, right? And what happens in the summer of '64 is that Lincoln is convinced that he's going to lose the election. The Republican Party has met and renominated him in June here in Baltimore, and they've put a plank in the platform that says, we're going to fight this fight to the finish. We are now committed to ending slavery. Elect us, re-elect Mr. Lincoln, and we're going to finish this thing right. The way we, should have. The Democrats don't meet until the 1st of September, which is exactly the time that Sherman finally takes Atlanta. Right? But by the time they hear that he's taken Atlanta, they've already approved the platform. And what their platform says, if you elect us, the Democrats, we'll end this war as fast as we can. And we'll do it by simply accommodating with Confederate leaders, and we will return to status quo antebellum. They never use the word slavery, but basically they're saying, if you, Alabama, want to reinstitute slavery, that's okay, you just do it. We just want to end this war. It's too big a mess, right? Which looked good, looked like a vote getter in July and August. Once Sherman has taken Atlanta, once Farragut has taken over Mobile Bay, it looks like treason. It's like, wait a minute, we're finally just about to win this war, and you guys are going to pull the plug? And you're nominating as your candidate this guy McClellan, who was the general who lost the Peninsula Campaign and who obviously cares nothing about slavery? This is crazy. these planks are terrible. So here's a pro-Republican cartoon that shows two-faced McClellan standing up on this terrible rickety platform that's being held up by Jefferson Davis and the devil and two copperhead congressmen from the North. And here's a Union soldier saying, Mac, I used to love you, but I can't vote for you standing on that rickety platform, right? And I could show you a dozen of these cartoons from both sides of the aisle where planks are the issue. You look at these planks, they point right to her, and there's a straw actually running right there that goes right. You look at these planks, they don't go to her at all. They stop right there. But if you follow them up, they go straight to the Confederate flag, you know, which is raised in this momentary victory here. There's a nice little balance which you picked up between the red, white, and blue of the Confederate flag and the red, white, and blue of her headdress. And I talk about that some in the book because it's actually a liberty cap. You know, it too is full of meaning. Everything's full of meaning in this picture. You know, her blouse is a Garibaldi blouse, and Garibaldi, that has a whole, I won't go into that. That's a whole bunch, you know, it's unbelievable how he just loads this stuff in. So that's the planks. Okay, so now let's talk just for a minute, and then I'll wrap up about her, and then I want to hear what you see here. Because obviously, I mean, she's not only standing on a mudsill, it's almost like, I mean, first of all, what's this house that she's in? You know, is this her cabin? It doesn't look like a cabin. Is this the back of the big house? Is this, or is this the Union? You know, is this America? You know, is she sort of coming out of the shadows through the back door of the United States? You know, and he manages somehow to capture this way in which she's moving forward and backward all at the same time. You know, she is caught between a rock and a hard place, the way we talked about in 201 this morning. You know, that it's not clear if she, and we have anecdotes about this. When Sherman is, and you'll back me up, and I hope, you know, when Sherman is marching through Georgia, there are slaves who come out and cheer for him. And then Sherman moves on 2 days later, and they go find her and say, okay, we saw that. And they take her down to a sycamore tree in a little town in South Carolina and string her up and hang her. You know, so if you jump too soon, you're dead. You know, but if you don't jump soon enough, you know, this may be your one chance. You know, so he captures some of that, you know, and most of all, he captures, she's thinking about this. You know, he has a wonderful way of drawing you, putting you inside her head and saying, you know, get into her world. What is she making out of this? You know, not what you make, whether you're rooting for the Union or the Confederates, you know, what would she make out of this moment of having, you know, she's lived her whole life and like her grandmother, thinking she's going to live and die in slavery, and all of a sudden here's an army that's within 10 meters of her house, and yet it's not going to happen, you know. So the ride, that's amazing emotional moment that he captures, and he does it just by clenching her left fist, you know. It's clear that it's like, oh, she's thinking about this, you know. Some people have told me, oh no, she's actually got a knife in this hand down here. So, you know, I mean, you don't know what's going on. Something's happened. You know, she is totally engaged in this situation. So now, two things, three more things before we stop. One is these gourds. You know, as Mary-Elaine said, I love gourds. I think that's one of the reasons I like this painting. But it turns out that gourds are, in antebellum times, were an emblem for freedom. You know, follow the drinking gourd. You know, the Big Dipper looked to African Americans like a drinking gourd, and so follow the drinking gourd was liberation. You know, just the way Douglass called his paper the North Star. You know, so if you're a painter, to put a gourd in the picture beside a black slave is to say thoughts of freedom. You know, this could be about freedom. I think I may have another picture here. I do. This is by another artist from the North, of blacks in a cornfield in Tennessee, and you see this boy in the foreground almost in a religious position, offering up a dipper gourd full of water to these workers, enslaved workers, right? It's almost like, and now he may just be offering them a drink on a hot day, but it's almost as though he's offering them a taste of freedom. You know, that in fact, you're in the cornfield today, but if you sort of slip off to the north, you can cross the Ohio River and you'll be free. You know, you see people sort of disappearing into the cornfield. It's just, and I think for someone aware of all the abolitionist literature and so on, like Thomas Waterman Wood, this would be, there's more to that gourd. Okay, so, but gourds have another meaning. That is, they grow very fast. They're related to pumpkins. You know, they grow very fast and they're full of seeds. So a gourd becomes an emblem of fecundity, pregnancy. So what if she's pregnant? Right? You can't tell. I mean, this is one of these Homer things. You know, maybe we've gone a step too far. Maybe we haven't. But right, if you bisect this picture, right, that, you know, that's the center of the picture, right there, behind this big white apron. You know, it's highlighted, and it's got a little curve to it, not much, you know. But she may even be just realizing that she's pregnant. You know, she's like, that fist may be feeling the first kick or something, you know. Now, and this, as I say, you don't have to go here, just think about it for a second. But because what it does, on the one hand, if you look at, this gives us July, August 1864, think about Civil War, think about Andersonville. It's very presentist oriented. Once you introduce pregnancy, you think about the next generation. You think about that little boy with the sunflower. You think about, okay, what comes next? You know, not only what's going to happen to her, what's going to happen to her progeny? Where's this all gonna go? You know, and you think about who's the daddy. You think back in the past. Where did this come from? You know, if she's pregnant, given what we know about slavery, and given what was obsessing the New Englanders about slavery, which was planters sleeping with their slaves, and then sleeping with the daughter of that slave, who's their daughter, but then they, you know, I mean, incestuous behavior that is violation of the 10th Commandments. Therefore, we need to go to war. You know, this obsessed these folks, right? So. And one of the things that the way they talked about it in biblical terms was Hagar. And Hagar is not central to a lot of modern theology, but in the black church and among black women, Hagar is a very respected figure because she's the African servant of Sarah and Abraham, and Sarah gives her to Abraham, this old man. He impregnates her. Sarah then gets mad that that's happened, throws her out of the house, and she's sent into the wilderness. God comes to her and says, you know, you may be bereft, but I know who you are. I'm still looking after you. And your son is going to be called Ishmael, and he will have a hard life, but many descendants. Right? So the black church has fastened on to that. You know? And so, you know, is he playing with that or not? I don't know. But what I want to leave you with is a final look at a couple of the things that Homer is reacting against. Because I think for us that the painting I've been talking about looks fairly innocuous. But you have to understand the context in which he's doing this is intensely racist. Mm-hmm. And it's intensely racist in the North as well as the South. It's intensely racist in Harper's magazine that Homer works for. So this is a picture of a black woman saying, "Oh, I was glad the Yankees has come," but she's portrayed as not quite getting it. She doesn't, you know. It's like, okay, she's not. It's not intense, right? Look at this picture, which has all the same element. It's got Union troops in the background, black woman with a bandana, but she's wide-eyed. And saying, "Oh, is all them Yankees that's passing? You know, like, what's this war all about? How'd this happen?" Right? I think Homer tore this out of Harper's magazine and stuck it up on his easel. You know, like, that's not what's going on. I know what's going on. Let's get inside her head. Let's not make fun of her. Let's deal with this differently. And I think he manages to do that. And we finally have a picture now that it's come down out of the attic that we can deal with. This is the picture that when I was in college and the centennial of the Civil War was being observed, this was the Civil War. You know, it was Billy Reb and Johnny Yank or whatever it is, you know, on opposite sides, squaring off against each other. It's like a good football game. Or so, you know, you pick your team you want to root for. You can respect this guy as a good Union officer. You can respect these frazzled Confederate prisoners who are putting up a great fight. They take up the whole picture. It's all about men at war on opposite sides. There are no women. There's no home front. If there's a black guy, it might be that guy, and there's some debate about whether he's a Union soldier in there. He might be, might not, but it's just a hint. Really, nothing more than that. That was the Civil War. Nothing more to be said, right? What's to be learned? Well, in the 50 years since then, we've learned that, my God, you know, if we factor in these millions of African Americans who are at the heart of this struggle and put ourselves in their shoes, look at the war from that perspective, we get a better understanding of the war, a better understanding of ourselves in the 21st century. So I would argue that just the way that picture was emblematic for the centennial, this should be our emblem for the sesquicentennial. And the big exhibit that's going to open over in the Smithsonian in November is going to bring this picture down from Newark and make it part of the exhibition, which I love that. And what I'm hoping is that thousands of people are going to discover it and understand it and realize that this is what's missing. And there was this guy named Winslow Homer who could see this 150 years ago. You know? And that as a culture, we put this away, we stuffed it in the attic, we took it down. It's taken us 50 years to get to this place, and we've still got a long way to go. But he was there way ahead of us, and it's a fabulous painting. Thanks very much.
I think we have not a great deal of time, but definitely a couple of questions, if anybody has one. Minde.
Thank you so much for a wonderful and illuminating talk. About this painting, since you pointed out that there's so much of symbolism in the work, including the colors and all that.
Yes.
As an artist, Winslow Homer may have been aware of, I'm sure he was aware of Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. That's a great painting
Yes.
Where the woman
Yes.
is a symbol of liberty, bare-breasted,
Yep.
and holding the red, white, and blue,
And wearing a freedom cap.
and
Climbing over the barricades, right.
Exactly. So I was wondering if not, if this woman here is in that sense kind of a symbol of freedom then. I mean, more than an actual, sort of a more
She's both.
vernacular narrative.
No, she's both. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so that was one thing in terms of, the
Yeah.
way she's positioned, the
Yes.
strength in the figure.
Yes, yes.
But then the fact that, as you pointed out, it was at such a racist time in American history,
Yes.
so whether or not, I mean, a lot of Winslow Homer's images of African Americans are, he puts them in a position of dignity,
Yes.
but yet in a position of not in a very active role. They seem
That's
to be
true.
like even the Gulf Stream,
Mhm.
he's sitting
Right,
there,
right,
and
yep,
it's
yep,
like,
yep.
so they are watching and waiting. There's the
Right.
sense of strength, but also passive,
That's a
a
good
little
point.
bit of passivity.
Mm,
So I don't
yeah.
know whether he was referencing Delacroix, but not putting her in that very active charging role that you have.
That's a good point. We could go a long way on this, but I'll try to be short. But one of the people who is a desk mate of Homer almost in the Harper's office is another young guy, a German immigrant named Thomas Nast. And he becomes the granddaddy of American political cartooning. And Nast would be on you. He's like, okay, let's show this image I showed of the black soldiers charging. That was Nast. Okay, look at this guy. He goes off and becomes a very, political cartooning becomes very exaggerated, very, like Delacroix, over the, onward and upward, pick the team you're rooting for, and then, Homer stands back, lets you figure it out. Are you rooting for her or not? That's your problem. I've made up my mind, but I'm not gonna try to, let's see what you think about this. I call it a Rorschach test, and so I think he's doing that, but he's playing with you, so this freedom cap, which Delacroix uses, and it's on all the American coins that are in Homer's pocket. They all have Lady Freedom with a Liberty cap. I was over at the Capitol yesterday, and the Capitol Dome has this Statue of Freedom up on top. They're now redoing it, so she looks like she's in prison. They've got a frame up around it. And one of my friends said to me, maybe they're changing her cap, because when it was designed in the 1850s, she was freedom. They put a freedom cap on her, and the chairman of the redecoration committee in Congress was a senator named Jefferson Davis from Mississippi. He said, "Oh no, wait a minute, you're not. I know what that is. That's a freedom cap. Get that off of there. You're making fun of the South, and you're not going to get away with that. So do something else, or we're not paying for it." So it has a big headdress on it now. It looks like it's just a something or other. But that symbolism was very loaded for these guys. So he's not going to make a bandana that's looks like Aunt Jemima. He's going to make it look like a freedom cap. So, but you're absolutely right that these are restrained. I would argue that he's asking you not to think about physical violence the way Nast was. Let's fight. Let's prove that we're tough. He's saying, get inside their heads. They're just like you. That person's just as smart as you are. What would you do in this situation? Would you run out there and start swearing at the Confederate soldiers and get killed the next day? Okay, that's your choice, right? I mean, he's saying, understand how difficult the dilemma these people face. I would say that about the Gulf Stream, which we talked about this morning. I would say that about this, that she's thought of all the options. She watched her husband try that 3 years ago and he got killed, right? Or whatever, she knows more than we do about all this. And I think he's inviting us to think about it.
Another question?
One more over
It's
here.
not a question, it's a
Good.
comment.
Good.
Do you have an agreement? The shadow of her shadow doesn't seem like it's the same shadow of the thatch or of the top roof or of the wall. Those shadows are to the right, and her shadow, if there is any, because I can't really tell, is just behind her.
Yeah, it's a good point. It's tricky. It's hard to tell. There you see a shadow here. She's obviously, her whole face should be in shadow, really, probably, and it isn't. And so
shadow in and of itself,
right.
is a strong statement.
It is, and he plays with shadows. I saw a picture yesterday in the Smithsonian, a famous one that he did called "Visit from the Old Mistress," and there's a strong black woman in a bandana right at the center of that picture, and her shadow is bigger than the white woman standing across from her. He plays with shadows and uses them. What intrigues me is that this shadow down here just stretches right back into the darkness. This is a very dark, she's emerging from a very dark place, and as African Americans were in 1864. And so you get, and she's just beginning to get into the sunlight enough so you can see her, but not so much that it's a done deal. She may have to recede into there, or McClellan may win the election, and they all may be re-enslaved. It's not, so, but you're right, and somebody else mentioned colors too, just the way in which this whole thing is sort of except for this red, white, and blue, is sort of a symphony in browns. It's white and black, and then every shade in between, all these different grays and browns, and of course she suggests that in her face that she may be mixed race herself. So that raises questions about her ancestry.
Andrew?
Is it dawn or sunset?
Well, it's neither, given the fact the sun's pretty high up in the sky, but it's a pretty pale sunshine, right? So that would be, it's nondescript. And again, Homer played with the weather a lot in terms of, as all these artists did. The person over at the Smithsonian is figuring a whole exhibit around landscape paintings and weather and how they used that as a metaphor during the Civil War and stuff. You know, so I think the light. You know, she's. It's, you know, it's summertime. It's hot, but it's kind of gray and dusty. The sky is a little bit blue, but not very blue. You know, it's caught in between. And now, and 1864 was, you know, it was not the sunrise or the sunset for any, you know, nobody knew what's going to come next anymore. You know, Lincoln didn't know, she didn't know. They're caught in this moment, and he captures that powerfully.
Well, if you have any more questions, let's do it over food, because
Yes,
I'm
let's
sure
do it.
you all are hungry, and let's give Dr. Wood a